candle flew from her hand the moment the floor gave way beneath her. She did not scream. There was no time. 1 second, she was hurrying through the dark corridor of Thornvale Manor, a tray of medicine balanced carefully in her arms, and the next, the rotted floorboard cracked like a gunshot, and she was falling, tumbling sideways through a hidden doorway she never knew existed, crashing straight into something warm, solid, and very much alive. The tray shattered, glass spilled across the cold stone, and the candle rolled into the corner, guttering but still alive, throwing just enough gold light across the room for her to see exactly whose lap she had landed in. The Duke of Ravenscroft, Edmund Harlow. The man half of England pitied and the other half feared. The man who had not left this wing of the manor in 3 years. The man they said would never walk again. His dark eyes were open, wide, locked onto her face with an intensity that made her forget how to breathe. She scrambled to rise, her palms pressing against his knees, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain he could hear it. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I did not mean to. The floor. It's simply... I am so sorry." He did not speak. He only stared. And then, slowly, with the kind of stillness that made the entire room feel like it was holding its breath, his hand came up and closed around her wrist. Not roughly, not cruelly, just firmly, like a man who had forgotten what it felt like to hold something and was not ready to let go. "You're not leaving," he said. His voice was low, unused, rough like gravel wrapped in velvet. "Not yet." She froze. He looked down at his own legs. Something flickered across his face. Something raw and unreadable, like a door opening in a room that had been locked for years. And that was the moment everything changed. "Now, before we go any further, I need to ask you something. If you woke up one morning and discovered you could feel again after years of nothing, what would your very first words be? Drop your answer in the comments and tell us where you are watching from. It helps more than you know. And if this story is already pulling at your heart, please hit that subscribe button right now. Because, trust me, you do not want to miss what happens next. The rain had been falling since dawn. It came down in thin, cold sheets over the moors of Thornvale, soaking the gravel paths and turning the estate gardens into something that looked more like a painting left out in a storm. The great house stood against the grey sky, like a man bracing for a fight, its stone walls dark with wet, its many windows watching the countryside like eyes that never blinked. Ivy Crestwood did not notice the beauty of it. She never had time to. She was already late. Her boots clicked fast against the servants' corridor as she balanced the morning medicine tray with both hands, her dark hair pinned up in a practical knot that was slowly losing the argument with gravity. 3 hairpins had already surrendered to the morning rush. A 4th was threatening to follow. She had been at Thornvale Manor for exactly 47 days. She knew this because she counted them each night before she slept, the way a prisoner marks the wall. Not out of misery, out of gratitude. Every day she remained employed was a day her younger sister Bet had food on her plate and coal in the grate back in the village. That was the whole of it. That was everything. Ivy was not a lady's companion, not a governess, not a cook. She had been hired as an under-assistant to the manor's physician, old Dr. Perrin, who was half-deaf and entirely forgetful, and needed someone young enough to remember where he had put things. The role was not glamorous. She spent most of her hours measuring powders, boiling herbs, recording notes in a ledger with a pen that always needed re-inking, and carrying trays to patients who did not want to see her, and medicines to rooms where the curtains were always drawn. The Duke's wing was always the last stop. Everyone at Thornvale knew the rules about the Duke's wing. You knocked, you waited, you entered only if the gruff voice from within gave permission. You placed the tray on the table by the door. You did not look too long at the man in the wheeled chair by the window. You did not ask questions. You did not offer sympathy. You left quickly and quietly, and you were grateful he had not thrown anything. Edmund Harlow, the 8th Duke of Ravenscroft, was 31 years old, and in the opinion of nearly everyone who served him, he was the most difficult man alive. He had not always been this way. The older servants said so, in whispers, when they thought no one young enough to repeat it was listening. They spoke of a man who had once ridden his horse across the estate at full gallop, just for the joy of it, who had hosted dinners that lasted until 2 a.m, who had laughed, actually laughed, in a way that filled rooms. They spoke of this other Edmund Harlow with a kind of sad reverence, the way people speak of someone who has died, but whose body is still present. 3 years ago, there was an accident, a carriage, a ravine. The details were never fully spoken aloud, but the result was something everyone could see. The Duke had come home from that night unable to walk, and something else, something harder to name, had come home with him too. Something that sat behind his eyes and made them cold. Ivy did not know all of this in the morning. Everything changed. She only knew the rules. Knock. Wait. Enter. Tray on the table. Do not linger. She did not get the chance to follow any of them that morning. The corridor on the Upper East Wing was older than the rest of the manor. Everyone knew it. The housekeeper, Mrs. Dunford, had been requesting repairs to the floorboards for 2 full years, submitting written notes that disappeared into the estate's administrative silence. The wood near the hidden servants' passage had been softening slowly, quietly, the way things rot when no one is watching. Ivy was moving quickly. The tray was heavy. The light in the corridor was poor. The board gave way without a single sound of warning. There was no creak, no groan, no polite announcement of its intentions. It simply broke, cleanly and completely, and the floor opened beneath her left foot, and her balance, already compromised by the weight of the tray, surrendered entirely. She fell sideways. The hidden door, the one that connected the servants' passage to the Duke's private study, swung inward under the sudden pressure of her weight hitting it. She had not known the door existed. No one had told her. She crashed through it in a cascade of shattering glass, spilling medicine, and the bright, terrible sound of a silver tray bouncing off stone, and she landed, heart first and breathless, directly in the lap of Edmund Harlow. The silence that followed was so complete it seemed to have weight. Ivy lay stunned across him, her cheek pressed against his chest, her hands flat against his legs, the smell of spilled tincture sharp in the cold air. The candle she had been carrying had rolled to the corner and was still burning, bravely and absurdly, casting a small circle of gold light in the otherwise dark room. She could feel him breathing. She could feel that he was very still. She pushed herself upright, palms pressing against his knees, and looked up. Edmund Harlow was staring at her. Not with anger. Not with surprise. With something she could not name, something that looked, for just one unguarded moment, like a man seeing daylight after a very long time underground. "I am so sorry," she said, and her voice came out smaller than she intended. "The floor, it broke. I did not know there was a door. I did not mean to. Your Grace, please forgive me." He still did not speak. She became very aware that his hand had come to rest against her arm. Not gripping, not restraining, just resting there, as though it had arrived without instruction from its owner. "You are not leaving," he said at last. His voice was low and rough and careful, like a man testing whether his own throat still worked. "Not yet." Ivy stopped moving. She looked at him properly then, for the first Time, because every previous visit had required that she not look too long. He was dark-haired and lean-faced, with shadows under his eyes that spoke of poor sleep and poorer peace. His jaw was sharp. His mouth was set in a line that suggested it had forgotten how to rest. He was, despite everything, or perhaps because of everything, strikingly handsome in the way that ruins are sometimes beautiful, structural, haunted, impossible to look away from. He looked down at his own legs, the legs she had just pressed her hands against, and something moved across his face. It was quick, and she almost missed it, but she did not miss it. It was wonder, raw and frightened and real. "Did you feel that?" he said. She did not understand the question. "Your Grace?" "When you pressed against my knees." His voice had dropped even lower. "Did you feel me press back?" The room seemed to tilt. Ivy looked down at his legs, then back at his face, and she saw it. The thing behind his eyes was not cold anymore. It was something cracking open, something that had been sealed for 3 years and was now, impossibly, beginning to breathe. She did not know what to say. She did not know what was happening. She only knew that the man everyone said felt nothing below the waist had just asked her if she felt him move. And she had. She stayed very still and said, quietly, honestly, "Yes, I did." Edmund Harlow closed his eyes, and for the first time in 3 years, something in his face went soft. Outside, the rain kept falling. Inside, the small candle in the corner burned on, steady and stubborn, refusing to go out. Ivy Crestwood did not know it yet, but she had just walked through a door that would never close behind her again. Dr. Perrin was not pleased. He stood in the doorway of the study, looking at the broken glass, the spilled tincture, the collapsed section of floorboard in the corridor, and Ivy standing in the middle of it all, slightly disheveled, cheeks flushed, with the particular expression of someone who has survived something and is not yet entirely sure what. "The medicine," he said, peering at the floor. "I will prepare another tray immediately," Ivy said. "The floorboard. I will report it to Mrs. Dunford. You went through the panel door. I did not know it was there." The doctor looked past her toward the Duke, who had not moved from his wheeled chair and was now watching the entire scene with an expression that gave nothing away. Dr. Perrin had served the Harlow family for 20 years. He was old enough and experienced enough to know when to stop asking questions. He looked at Ivy, then at the Duke, then back at Ivy. "Clean this up," he said, "then come and find me." He left. His footsteps faded down the corridor with the particular speed of a man removing himself from something he did not want to be responsible for. Ivy bent down and began gathering the broken glass carefully, wrapping the pieces in her apron cloth. She worked in silence. The Duke watched her work. The room felt different from every other room in the manor, denser somehow, like the air inside it was older and had been breathed too many times. "What is your name?" he asked. She looked up. He was not looking at her with the cold, fixed stare she had braced herself for. He was looking at her the way a man looks at something unexpected that has arrived in a place where nothing unexpected ever happens. "Ivy Crestwood, Your Grace. I assist Dr. Perrin." "How long have you been here?" 47 days. Something shifted in his expression. "You counted." "I count everything," she said. "It is a habit." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Why?" She sat back on her heels and looked at him, directly, which was probably not the correct thing to do with a duke. But the question had been genuinely curious, and it deserved a genuine answer. "Because when things feel uncertain, numbers are steady. They do not change their minds." He looked at her for a long moment. That is either very practical or very sad. Most practical things are a little sad, she said. Then she caught herself. Forgive me, Your Grace. I do not usually speak so freely. Do not apologize, he said quietly. Everyone else in this house speaks to me as though I might shatter. It is exhausting. Ivy finished gathering the glass and stood. She looked at the ruined tray, at the stain spreading slowly across the stone floor, at the pale grey light coming through the study's single tall window. The room was large and almost entirely empty of comfort. There were books, yes, stacked in towers on the floor because the shelves had not been dusted in months, and the Duke apparently did not care. There was a cold fireplace. There was the wheeled chair. There was a narrow bed in the corner that looked like it had not been slept in properly in some time. And there was the man himself, sitting in the center of all that emptiness, like a king who had dismissed his entire court and was only now beginning to regret it. You said you felt something, Ivy said. She was not sure why she said it. It was not her place. It was possibly the most inappropriate thing she could have said. But the question had been sitting in her chest since he had asked it, and she could not carry it quietly anymore. Edmund Harlow went very still. I have not told anyone else that, he said. I know. I will not repeat it. Why not? It would be considerable gossip. I am not interested in gossip, she said. I am interested in whether it is true. He looked at her for so long that she started to feel warm across the back of her neck and had to resist the urge to check whether the fireplace had somehow lit itself. It has been happening for about 6 weeks, he said at last, and his voice was quiet in the way confessions are quiet, not soft, but careful. Small things. A pressure. A heat. I told Perham. He was cautious. Said nerves can sometimes send false signals. Said not to hope. Did you hope anyway? No, he said. Then, yes. Privately. Ivy nodded slowly. That seems like the right answer. He tilted his head slightly. You are a very strange person to work for a physician. I have been told I am a very strange person in general. For a moment, the corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was the shape a smile makes when it has forgotten the steps and is trying to remember them from description alone. Ivy picked up the ruined cloth, folded it neatly, and set it on the edge of the empty shelf by the door. She should leave. She had already stayed too long. She had already said too much. Dr. Perrin was waiting, and Mrs. Dunford would need to know about the floor, and there were 3 other patients in the manor who needed their morning medicines adjusted. She turned toward the broken door. Miss Crestwood. She stopped. Come back this afternoon, he said, with the adjusted tincture. Dr. Perrin usually brings the afternoon medicine himself. Tell him I have requested you. She turned to look at him. He was watching her steadily, and there was something in his face that was new, something that had not been there before she fell through the door, a kind of alert attention, as though a light had been turned on in a room that had grown used to the dark. Yes, Your Grace, she said. She left. She walked back through the panel door, stepping carefully over the broken section of floor, and as soon as she was in the corridor and the door had swung shut behind her, she exhaled a breath she had apparently been holding for quite some time. In the Manor's kitchen, over a cup of tea she barely tasted, she told herself firmly that nothing unusual had happened. A floor had broken. She had fallen. She had made conversation which was impolite and probably unwise. She had been asked to return, which was simply a medical request and nothing more. She counted the tiles on the kitchen floor. There were 32 of them. Numbers were steady. They did not change their minds. But when she closed her eyes for a moment, she could still feel the weight of his hand resting against her arm. not gripping, not restraining, just resting there, warm and uncertain, like something that had reached out before its owner had thought better of it. 32 tiles. She opened her eyes. Down the long corridor of the West Wing, she could hear Mrs. Dunford already interrogating a footman about the state of the East Passage. She could hear the distant sounds of the manor's daily rhythm, fires being built up, linens being beaten, horses being walked in the wet courtyard below. Thornvale was a house with many moving pieces, and she was one of the smallest of them. She thought about what he had said, about hoping privately, about nerves sending false signals, about everyone speaking to him as though he might shatter. Then she thought about his face, that fraction of a second when she had pressed her hands against his knees, and he had felt it. The way his eyes had gone wide and then gone inward, as though the sensation had travelled somewhere deep inside him and was still echoing there. She thought about a man sitting alone in a dim room for 3 years, telling himself not to hope, and hoping anyway. She finished her tea. She had work to do, but she was already, in some quiet and irrevocable way, thinking about the afternoon. Across the manor, behind the closed door of his study, Edmund Harlow sat very still in his chair and looked at his own hands. His right hand, the one that had reached out and rested against her arm without his permission, or perhaps with a kind of permission he had stopped believing he still possessed. He had not touched another person, voluntarily, in 3 years. He had permitted Dr. Perrin to examine him. He had allowed servants to assist him when absolutely necessary. But to reach out, to choose contact, to place his hand against another person because something in him wanted to, that had not happened since the night of the accident. He pressed his hand flat against his knee. Then he waited. There it was again, faint, like a word spoken in another room, muffled but present. A pressure, a signal, a thread of feeling in a body he had spent 3 years believing was broken past repair. He had told himself 100 times not to trust it. The doctor had been careful, had used words like unlikely and gradual and managed your expectations, which were the words medical men used when they didn't want to be held responsible for hope. But she had felt it too. She had said so directly, without fuss, without drama, without the careful tiptoeing everyone else in this house had perfected. She had looked at him and said, simply yes. He stared at the door through which she had disappeared. 47 days, she had said. She had been in this house 47 days, and he had not known she existed. He had not known her voice, or her directness, or the particular way she looked at a person, as though she was genuinely, practically, unsentimental, interested in the truth of them. He thought about what she had said, about numbers being steady, about practical things being a little sad. He thought, for the first time in a very long while, that the afternoon could not come quickly enough. She almost did not go back. Not because she did not want to. That was exactly the problem. She wanted to, and wanting things that had nothing to do with survival was a luxury Ivy Crestwood had trained herself out of a long time ago. She stood outside the kitchen with the freshly prepared tray in her hands and had a very firm, very sensible conversation with herself. He was a duke. She was the assistant to an aging physician. He was recovering from a serious injury. She was there to deliver medicine, not conversation, and certainly not whatever that had been this morning, that strange and too warm exchange that had left her counting kitchen tiles like a woman trying to hold herself together at the seams. Dr. Perrin had raised an eyebrow when she relayed the Duke's request. Just one eyebrow. It was the most expressive thing the old man had done in weeks. "He asked for you specifically," Perrin had said. "Yes. Edmund Harlow asked for a specific person." "He did." The doctor had looked at her over the rim of his spectacles for a long, assessing moment. Then he had said, "Do not be late," and walked away, which told her absolutely nothing and somehow told her everything. She went. The panel door had been propped open by one of the footmen who had been dispatched to survey the damage to the floorboard. A young carpenter named Tom was already on his knees measuring the broken section, muttering to himself about the quality of the original wood, and he nodded at Ivy as she stepped through carefully. She knocked on the inner door of the study. "Come in." His voice was different in the afternoon, not softer, exactly, but less guarded, like a gate that had been unlocked, even if it had not yet been opened. She entered. The curtains had been pulled back. This was the first thing she noticed because, on every previous visit to this wing, the curtains had been closed. Grey afternoon light was falling across the room in long, cool rectangles, and Edmund Harlow was sitting in his wheeled chair with a book open across his lap. He was not reading it. He was looking at the window. But the fact of the light, the fact of the open curtains, felt like a statement of some kind. Though she could not have said exactly what it was declaring, he turned when she entered. "You came," he said. "You requested it. People do not always do what I request." She set the tray on the proper table and turned to face him. "That surprises me. You seem like a man people would find difficult to refuse." "They find me difficult to approach," he said, "which is different. They agree to my face and then find reasons not to follow through." Something in his jaw tightened briefly. "Apparently I am easier to manage at a distance." Ivy looked at him steadily. There was bitterness in those words, but underneath the bitterness was something else, something older, something that had been sitting with him long before the accident and the wheeled chair and the closed curtains. "Were you always like that?" she asked. "Someone people found easier to manage from far away?" The question landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. She saw him absorb it, saw something flicker behind his eyes. "You ask questions no one else asks," he said. "I can stop." "I did not say to stop." She pulled the small stool from beside the bookshelf and sat down, because standing over a seated person while having a real conversation had always seemed rude to her, and she did not intend to start being rude now. He watched her do this with an expression she was beginning to recognize, that alert, slightly startled look, as though ordinary gestures of ease kept surprising him. "My father was a man people managed from a distance," he said at last. "I grew up watching it. I swore I would be different." A pause. "Somewhere along the way, I became exactly the same, through a different route." "What route?" "Impatience," he said flatly. "I had no tolerance for pretense, for people who said one thing and meant another, for drawing rooms full of performance. I was too blunt, too demanding. It drove people away, and eventually I stopped noticing the distance because I had convinced myself I preferred it." He said all of this with the kind of directness that told her he had not spoken it aloud before, but had been carrying it, fully formed, for quite some time. "And now," she said quietly. He looked at the window. "Now I have had 3 years of the distance I convinced myself I wanted, and it turns out I was lying to myself." The room was very quiet. Outside, the rain had stopped. The grounds of Thornvale were visible through the window, wet and green and steaming faintly in the thin afternoon light. A gardener was working near the stone wall at the far edge, small and distant, and somewhere in the house a clock was ticking. "Can I see something?" Ivy said. He looked back at her. She stood, moved to stand directly in front of him, and crouched down so she was at his eye level. This was, she was aware, highly irregular. She was also aware that she no longer particularly cared. "May I?" she said, and gestured toward his knee. Something passed over his face. not suspicion. Something more like the expression a person makes when they are bracing for a disappointment they have already survived 100 times and are preparing to survive again. "Yes," he said. She placed both hands flat against his knees, the way they had landed that morning without planning or permission. She pressed gently and waited. 3 seconds. 4. 5. And then, unmistakably, she felt it. A slow, deliberate pressure back. Not a twitch, not a spasm. Not the random misfire of damaged nerves that Dr. Perrin had warned against interpreting too broadly. This was intention. This was a man pressing back because he chose to. She looked up. Edmund Harlow was gripping the arms of his chair so hard his knuckles had gone white. His face was rigid with the effort of containing something enormous. His eyes were bright in a way she hadn't seen in any living face before, that particular brightness that lives right on the border between joy and terror. "That is not a false signal," she said. "No," he said. His voice had gone rough. "It is not." "How much can you feel?" "More than yesterday." He exhaled slowly. "Much more than last week." "Edmund," she said, and she said it without thinking, without the title, without the distance, just his name, plain and human. She saw him flinch at the sound of it, not with offense, with something closer to shock, the shock of being addressed as a person rather than a position. "You need to tell Dr. Perrin everything. Today. Not a careful version. Everything." He looked at her for a long moment. "I will," he said, "if you stay while I do." She should have said no. Every sensible rule of her employment, her station, her practical and carefully maintained understanding of her own life, said no. "All right," she said. She did not examine why. Dr. Perrin arrived within the hour. The examination that followed was the most thorough the old physician had performed in months, and the notes he took filled 4 pages of his ledger in increasingly agitated handwriting. He tested pressure response, heat response, and range of movement in a quiet, methodical frenzy, and when he finally set down his pen and looked at Edmund Harlow over his spectacles, his expression was one Ivy had never seen on him before. "This is real," Perrin said, in the tone of a man who had spent 20 years being cautious and was now reckoning with the cost of that caution. "This is genuine recovery. Significant. I do not fully understand it." Edmund said nothing. He was looking at Ivy. "Can he walk?" Ivy asked. "Not yet, but the nerve response suggests it is possible, with the right exercises, the right care." Perrin paused. "It will take time. It will be painful. There are no guarantees." "I understand," Edmund said. "Do you?" the doctor said, with unexpected sharpness. "Because hope is a dangerous thing in this situation. If you build it too high and the progress stalls, the fall is brutal. I have been on the floor of that fall for 3 years," Edmund said quietly. "I am not afraid of it." Perrin gathered his things, gave Ivy a long look she could not fully interpret, and left. The room settled into silence again. Ivy stood by the window, looking out at the wet grounds. She could feel Edmund watching her. She had been aware of his gaze for the better part of the last 2 hours, steady and deliberate, the way a man looks at something he is trying to memorize. "Why did you agree to stay?" he asked. She considered lying. She considered something polite and practical about medical procedure. "Because someone should be here when good news arrives," she said, "and it seemed like you had been alone when the bad news came often enough." The silence that followed was different from the others. Warmer. Heavier in a way that was not uncomfortable. "Miss Crestwood," he said. She turned. He was looking at her with that open, unguarded expression that still startled her every time it appeared on a face so accustomed to being closed. "Thank you," he said. 2 words, plain and direct. But the way he said them made them feel like something much larger, something that had been waiting a long time to be given to the right person. She nodded once, picked up her empty tray, and left before her expression could tell him anything she was not ready to say. She did not sleep well that night. She lay in her narrow bed in the servants' quarters and stared at the ceiling and thought about the pressure of his hands through his knees, about the brightness in his eyes, about the way he had said her name, not Miss Crestwood, but her name, Edmund, the way she had said his, without armor, without distance, like two people in a room with no audience and no performance required. She thought about his face when Perrin had said, "Genuine recovery." She thought about a man sitting alone in the dark for 3 years, managing the distance he had created, paying for it every single day, and refusing to let anyone see the cost. She turned onto her side and counted the nails in the wooden wall panel beside her bed. 14 nails. It did not help as much as usual. 3 weeks passed. They were the strangest 3 weeks of Ivy's life, and her life had not been short on strangeness. Every afternoon, she brought the medicine tray to the Duke's study. Every afternoon, she stayed longer than the medicine delivery required. Dr. Perrin had, with great and deliberate tact, begun finding reasons to send her in his place, and had stopped making any comment about it whatsoever, which was its own kind of commentary. The exercises began in the 2nd week. Perrin designed them, careful and precise, and Ivy administered them because Edmund refused to do them when the doctor was present and watching with his cautious, measuring eyes. With Ivy it was different. With Ivy he would work until sweat stood on his forehead and his hands shook against the arms of the chair, and he had pushed past every limit Perrin had set, and she would simply be there, steady and present, handing him water and saying nothing dramatic and treating his effort like the ordinary, remarkable thing it was. He could feel his left leg completely now. The right was following, slower, like a man waking up reluctantly from a long sleep. On the 14th day, he lifted his left foot off the footrest of the wheeled chair. Just an inch. Just for a moment. But he lifted it under his own power, and when he set it back down, his head dropped forward, and he pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. And Ivy stood 3 feet away and didn't say anything, because there are moments that belong entirely to the person living them and require nothing from anyone else. After a long moment, he looked up. His eyes were red at the edges. He was not a man who cried easily, she had learned. He was a man who felt things at an enormous depth and then kept them below the surface through sheer force of will. But the surface was cracking. 1 inch, he said. 1 inch, she agreed. It is nothing. It is everything, she said. And you know it. He looked at her, and something moved through his expression that she had no name for yet. Something that made her chest feel too small for everything it was trying to hold. But there were complications. There were always complications. The first arrived on the 15th day in the form of Lord Desmond Cale, Edmund's cousin, and, in the absence of a direct heir, the man who stood to inherit the Ravenscroft title and estate if Edmund died without issue. Lord Cale was 40, trim, carefully dressed, and possessed of the particular charm that belongs to people who have practiced it so thoroughly it has replaced anything genuine underneath. He arrived at Thornvale without announcement on a grey Tuesday morning, striding through the entrance hall with the comfortable authority of a man who already thought of the place as his, and within an hour of his arrival, the temperature of the entire manor seemed to drop by several degrees. Ivy encountered him in the east corridor. She was carrying the afternoon tray. He was walking, with his hands clasped behind his back, inspecting the paintings on the wall with an appraiser's eye rather than an admirer's. He turned when he heard her footsteps and looked at her, the way men of his kind often looked at women of her station, with a sliding, assessing attention that took inventory without asking permission. "You," he said pleasantly. "What is your function here?" "I assist Dr. Perrin, my lord." "Ah." He tilted his head slightly. "You are the one Edmund has been requesting." Something about the way he said it made the back of her neck prickle. Not the words, the tone, the subtle weight he placed on the word requesting, as though it meant something other than what it said. "I administer the Duke's afternoon treatment," she said evenly. "Of course you do," Cale said, and smiled. The smile did not reach his eyes by some distance. How convenient that he has taken such a personal interest in his own recovery. He was entirely indifferent to it for 3 years. No, we all tried. His mother wrote. His physicians adjusted and readjusted their methods. The smile remained perfectly in place. And then a girl with a medicine tray appears, and suddenly he is interested in getting better. Ivy held the tray steadily and said nothing. "I am not making an accusation," Cale said, with the ease of someone who is absolutely making an accusation. "I simply find it interesting. People in positions of vulnerability can be influenced in unexpected ways. Attachments form. Dependence can masquerade as progress." He paused. "I would hate for my cousin to be taken advantage of in a moment of weakness." "I would hate that too," Ivy said. "My lord." She held his gaze for exactly long enough to be clear that she had heard everything he had not said, then walked past him and continued down the corridor. Her hands were perfectly steady. The rest of her was not. She told Edmund about the encounter that afternoon. She did not intend to. She had planned to say nothing, to carry it alone, to manage it the way she managed most things, by herself and in silence. But he asked her, the moment she entered, why she looked like she was holding something heavy, and she had discovered over 3 weeks that she was almost constitutionally incapable of lying to this particular face. She told him everything Cale had said, all of it. The words and the tone and the smile that was not a smile. Edmund listened without interrupting. His face went very still in the way it went still when something was making him deeply, quietly furious. When she finished, he was silent for a moment. "He said you were taking advantage of my vulnerability," he said. He implied it. "What did you say?" "Nothing useful. I agreed that I would hate for you to be taken advantage of, and then I left." Edmund looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, quietly and without any drama at all, "You are the only person in this house I trust." The words fell into the room and sat there. Ivy felt them land somewhere deep inside her chest, in a place she had been careful to keep empty. "That is because I am the only person in this house who treats you like a person," she said carefully. "That is not a difficult standard to meet." "You are wrong," he said. "It has proven extremely difficult. You are simply making it look easy." She looked away, out the window, at the grounds where 2 of the stable hands were working with a young horse in the far paddock, patient and methodical. "Cale wants you to dismiss me," she said. "Cale wants many things that are not going to happen. He has influence. He is your heir. If he raises concerns with the estate board or with your family's solicitors, he can raise whatever he likes," Edmund said, and there was an edge in his voice now, the first edge she had heard directed outward rather than inward. A man who had spent 3 years turned against himself, finally finding a different direction for the force of him. "He has been waiting for 3 years for me to die or surrender the title. He's going to be disappointed on both counts." Ivy turned back to face him. He was gripping the arms of his chair, but it was different from the way he had gripped it during the exercises. Not effort this time, but decision. "Stand up," she said. He looked at her sharply. "Right now," he said. "Right now." Her voice was calm and completely serious. "Not because of Cale, not to prove anything to anyone else. Because you can. I have watched you for 2 weeks. I know what your body can do. You have been waiting for the right moment, and you will keep waiting forever unless someone tells you the moment is now." His jaw tightened. Perrin said not yet. Perrin said be careful. He did not say never. There is a difference. She moved forward and stood directly in front of him. "I will be right here. You will not fall. And if you do, I will catch you. But you are not going to fall." A long silence. Edmund looked at her face. She looked back at him. She could see the war in him, the 3 years of bracing for disappointment, doing battle with something newer and rawer and more dangerous. She could see the man who had hoped privately fighting the man who had learned to expect nothing. Then, slowly, Edmund Harlow placed both hands flat on the arms of his chair, and he pushed. His legs shook. His entire body shook. Ivy stepped forward instinctively, one hand braced at his arm, not holding him up, just present, just there. His breath came out hard and fast, and his teeth were set together, and every muscle in his face and neck was straining with the effort of it. He rose. Not all the way. Not fully upright. But he rose, halfway from the chair, suspended between sitting and standing, weight on his own legs, trembling but there, present, bearing him. For 4 seconds he held it. Then his legs gave in, and he dropped back into the chair hard, breathing like he had run a mile, head back, eyes closed. Ivy stood in front of him, with her heart hammering somewhere in her throat. Then Edmund Harlow opened his eyes. He looked up at her from the chair, still breathing hard, and something in his face had broken open entirely, something that couldn't be closed back up, and didn't want to be. His eyes were bright and fierce and frightened and alive, more alive than she had ever seen in any person, the look of someone who had just touched something they believed was gone forever. His hand came up and caught her wrist. Not rough, not gentle either. Just absolute. "Ivy," he said. His voice was shaking. She looked down at him. And Edmund Harlow, the 8th Duke of Ravenscroft, the man who had not chosen to touch another person in 3 years, the man who had mastered the management of distance and silence and the performance of not needing anyone, looked up at her from the chair where he had just stood on his own legs for the first time since the accident, and said it, low, certain, with the particular quality of a declaration that has been forming for 3 weeks in the bones of a man who does not say things he does not mean. "You are mine." 3 words, not a question, not a request. The statement of a man who has just discovered something true about himself and has chosen, for the first time in a very long time, to say it out loud. Ivy did not move. She stood in the afternoon light with his hand wrapped around her wrist and his eyes on her face, and the words still ringing in the room like a bell that had not been struck in years. She should have corrected him. She should have pulled her hand back gently and reminded him of every distance between them, of title and station, and what was possible and what was not. She did none of those things. She looked at him for a long, still moment. And then, very quietly, she said, "That is not something you get to simply decide." He held her gaze. "I know," he said. "I intend to earn it." Outside the window, the young horse in the paddock had finally stilled beneath the stable hand's patient touch, standing quiet and trusting where it had been wild and frightened an hour before. Inside, the clock on the mantel kept ticking, and Ivy Crestwood stood in the fading afternoon light with a duke's hand around her wrist and a declaration in the air between them, and felt with terrifying clarity that the numbers she had been counting to keep herself steady had just stopped being enough. The manor knew before anyone said a word. That was the nature of great houses. They breathed, they listened through their walls. They carried whispers from room to room, the way rivers carry leaves, without effort, without intention, simply because that was what they did. By the following morning, every servant in Thornvale knew that something had shifted in the east wing. Nobody could name it precisely. Tom the carpenter, who had been finishing the repairs on the floorboard, said the Duke had been heard speaking in a normal voice for the first time in memory, not calling for something or dismissing someone, but actually speaking the way people speak when there is another person in the room whose presence they are glad of. Mrs. Dunford, who noticed everything and said only what served her purposes, had observed that the curtains in the study had been opened 3 days in a row. The kitchen maid who brought the morning coal said the fireplace had been lit before she arrived, which meant someone in that room had been awake early enough and motivated enough to light it themselves. Small things. But in a house that had been running on silence and careful management for 3 years, small things were enormous. Lord Desmond Cale noticed all of it. He had been at Thornvale for 4 days now, and he moved through the manor with the patience of a man who was very good at waiting. He took his meals in the dining room. He spoke pleasantly to the staff. He requested access to the estate accounts, citing his role as prospective heir. And when Mrs. Dunford referred the request to the Duke's solicitor, Mr. Bramwell, Cale simply smiled and said, "Of course," and went away and came back the next day with a different angle. He was, Ivy thought, like water, finding every crack, testing every joint. She watched him the way she had learned to watch difficult things, from a careful distance, with full attention. On the 5th morning of his visit, Cale did something that changed the shape of everything. He went to the village. Specifically, he went to the village where Ivy's sister Bet lived, in the small rented cottage that Ivy's wages kept. He introduced himself to the landlord of the property as a representative of the Ravenscroft estate, conducting a routine review of staff arrangements. He was pleasant. He was charming. He left behind, entirely by accident, a folded piece of paper with a number written on it. The number represented, to a penny, the remainder of the annual rent on Bet's cottage. The implication was as clear as glass and twice as sharp. Ivy found out through a letter that arrived 2 days later, written in Bet's careful, slightly cramped handwriting. Bet was 17, practical beyond her years, and deeply unfrightened by most things, but the letter was frightened, not dramatically, just around the edges. Just enough. Ivy read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it very precisely and put it in her apron pocket and went about her morning as though nothing had happened. She did not tell Edmund. She told herself she was protecting him from a distraction during a critical period of his recovery. She told herself it was a practical decision. She told herself many things, standing at the medicine table with her hands moving through their familiar tasks, and she believed approximately none of them. The truth was simpler and harder. She was frightened. Not of Cale, not exactly. She was frightened of what Edmund would do if he knew. She was frightened of the look she had seen on his face when he had said, "You are mine." That open, unguarded, fully committed look of a man who had decided something and meant every syllable of it. She was frightened of how much she wanted to simply hand him the letter and watch him handle it, which was the precise kind of wanting that she had spent her whole life training herself not to feel. She had no business wanting to be handled by anyone. She had Bet to think about. She had her position. She had her 32 kitchen tiles and her 14 nails and the numbers that were supposed to keep her steady. She avoided the study that afternoon. She sent a message through the housemaid saying Dr. Perrin would be attending instead, citing a preparation requirement for the evening medicine. It was not entirely a lie. She did prepare the evening medicine. She also sat in the small preparation room off the kitchen for 2 hours afterward, doing absolutely nothing, which was so unlike her that the kitchen maid who came in for a ladle stopped and stared. Edmund sent a note back within the hour. She almost did not open it. She opened it. It said, in handwriting that was bold and slightly impatient, "I know you are avoiding this room. Whatever has happened, come and tell me. I am not made of glass, and I am tired of being managed." She pressed her thumb against the words, and felt something in her chest pull tight and then release, like a knot coming undone against its own better judgment. She went. He was not in the wheeled chair when she entered. He was at the window, standing, holding the frame with one hand for balance, but standing, upright, on his own legs in the afternoon light. He had clearly been working at it for hours. He was pale with the effort of it. He was also, unmistakably, refusing to sit back down before she saw him. She stopped in the doorway. He turned his head and looked at her, and she looked at him, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. "Show off," she said finally. Something that was almost a laugh crossed his face. "Come in and close the door." She did both. She told him about Cale, about the village visit, about the letter. She handed him the folded paper and watched him read it, watched his jaw set and his eyes go cold in a very specific way, not the cold of 3 years ago, not the inward cold of a man turned against himself, but an outward, directed, entirely purposeful cold, the cold of a man who has just identified the thing he intends to remove from his life. "He threatened your sister," Edmund said. Very calm, very quiet, the quietest kind of dangerous. He implied a threat. He did not make one explicitly. He went to your sister's home and left a number beside her rent. Edmund set the letter down on the windowsill. That is a threat. The fact that he used a number instead of words does not make it a courtesy. I know. Why did you not tell me immediately? She looked at him. Because I was afraid of what you would do. You were afraid I would handle it. I was afraid I would let you. She said it quietly, but without flinching. And I have been handling things by myself for a long time. Letting someone else handle something feels a great deal like falling, and I do not have a very good recent history with falling. It tends to land me somewhere unexpected. He looked at her for a long moment. The window light was behind him, and his face was in partial shadow, but she could see his expression clearly enough. It was not impatient. It was not frustrating. It was something much more careful and much more deliberate. "Ivy," he said, "look at where the last fall landed you." She opened her mouth. She closed it again. He pushed off from the window frame and took a step toward her, his first full unassisted step, slow and effortful and completely intentional, and then another. And then he was standing 2 feet away from her, without holding anything, slightly unsteady, enormously present. "I am not going to take anything from you," he said. "Not your independence, not your sister, not the way you count things when you are frightened, or the way you say uncomfortable truths to people who need to hear them." His voice was low and steady. "I am asking you to let me stand beside you, not in front of you, beside you." Ivy looked up at him. He was tall. She had not fully appreciated how tall until this moment, standing without the chair, filling the space differently, all of him present and upright and looking at her with those dark eyes that had stopped pretending to be cold. "Cale will not stop," she said. "He wants this estate. He wants your title. And right now he has decided that the clearest path to both of those things runs through me." "Then we remove the path," Edmund said simply. "How?" "By making it irrelevant." He reached out and took her hand. Not her wrist this time. Her hand, properly, his fingers closing around hers with the deliberate care of a man handling something he values. "Marry me." The room went absolutely still. Ivy stared at him. "That is," she said carefully, "a very dramatic solution. It solves the problem entirely. You become the Duchess of Ravenscroft. Cale's leverage over you disappears. Your sister is secure. The estate is beyond his reach." He paused, "and I get to stop pretending I have not been thinking about this for 3 weeks. You have been thinking about this for 3 weeks. Since approximately the 4th day, he said, when you told me that practical things were a little sad and then looked embarrassed for having said it." Ivy looked at their joined hands, then at his face, then at the window behind him, where Thornvale's grounds stretched wet and green in the afternoon light. "Edmund," she said, and she said it the same way she had said it the first time, plain and human, without armor. "You cannot marry someone because they fell into your lap." "I am not," he said. "I am marrying someone because she walked into a room where everything was dark and proceeded, without fanfare and without asking for anything in return, to make it lighter." The falling was incidental. She felt something in her chest crack open the way ice cracks in spring, not breaking, but releasing, the sound of something that has been held rigid for too long, finally deciding it no longer needs to be. "I will need time," she said. "You have it. I will need to speak to Bet." "Of course. And I have conditions. Name them." "I remain who I am. I do not become someone managed and displayed and quieted into an appropriate shape for drawing rooms." She held his gaze. "I count things. I say uncomfortable truths. I will absolutely argue with you." "I am counting on all 3, he said, and this time the corner of his mouth did not just move. It completed itself. A real smile, full and unguarded, the smile of a man who has found something he was not sure still existed and is holding it with both hands. Ivy looked at him for a long moment. Then, very softly, she said, "Ask me again in a week." "Why a week?" "Because I want to see you walk properly first," she said. "I refuse to marry a man who cannot dance." Edmund Harlow laughed. It came out rough and slightly rusty with disuse, but it was real, it was full, it filled the room the way the older servants had once described, and it was the most beautiful sound Ivy had ever heard in her life, and she was absolutely not going to tell him that today. She squeezed his hand once and let go, and went to the medicine tray to begin the afternoon treatment, and behind her she could hear him lowering himself carefully back into the chair, still breathing with the effort of standing, and outside the window, the grounds of Thornvale were catching the last of the afternoon light, gold and wet and quietly magnificent. She allowed herself, with her back to him and her hands on the tray, one small, private, unguarded smile. Then she turned around and got to work. Downstairs, Lord Desmond Cale was writing a letter to the family solicitor. He wrote carefully. He chose his words with precision. He outlined his concerns about the Duke's state of mind, about undue influence from a member of staff, about the potential for decisions made during a period of medical vulnerability to be later contested. He signed it with a flourish, sanded it, and sealed it. He did not know, as he handed it to the footman for dispatch, that the footman's name was George, and that George had worked at Thornvale for 11 years, and that George had been present the night the Duke's carriage had come back from the ravine, and that George had been one of the people who had carried Edmund Harlow through the front door and up the stairs, and that George was not, under any circumstances, going to let that letter leave the estate. Some loyalties run deeper than position. The letter never reached the solicitor. The week passed, the way extraordinary weeks do, faster than it should have and slower than it felt, each day dense with small things that were not small at all. Edmund walked the length of his study on the third day, 12 feet from the window to the door, unassisted, with Ivy standing at the far end, watching him with her arms crossed, and her expression professionally neutral, and her eyes giving away everything. On the fourth day, he walked into the corridor. On the fifth day, he reached the top of the staircase, and stood there looking down the length of Thornvale's grand entrance hall, and Ivy stood beside him, and neither of them spoke for a long time, because some things do not need commentary. Mrs. Dunford was the first to see him in the hallway. She was crossing the entrance hall below with a stack of linens, and she looked up and stopped completely still, the linens held against her chest, and her face did something complex and quiet that she covered quickly and professionally, but not quickly enough. "Good morning, Your Grace," she said. "Good morning, Mrs. Dunford," Edmund said. His voice carried down the staircase clearly and easily. "I believe the east drawing room needs to be reopened. We will be having guests this week." Mrs. Dunford blinked once. "Yes, Your Grace." "Of course, Your Grace." She walked away with the particular rapid purposefulness of a woman who is going to tell everyone in the kitchen exactly what she just saw and needs to do it immediately. The guests Edmund had in mind were specific. The first was his mother, the Dowager Duchess Margaret Harlow, who had been writing letters to Thornvale for 3 years that had gone largely unanswered, and who arrived 2 days later in a state of carefully restrained anxiety that dissolved the moment she saw her son standing in the entrance hall to receive her, into something that was not restrained at all. She crossed the hall and took his face in both her hands, the way mothers do when they have been frightened for a long time, and Edmund let her, which was its own kind of miracle for a man who had spent years keeping people at managed distances. "You are standing," she said. "I am standing." "Edmund." Her voice broke on his name, just once. Then she collected herself with the particular steel of a woman who has run a ducal household for 40 years, and lifted her chin and said, "You look dreadful. Have you been sleeping?" "Better recently," he said. "Good." She looked past him and found Ivy standing a few feet back, correctly positioned, appropriately quiet, giving the reunion its proper space. The Dowager looked at Ivy with the sharp, comprehensive attention of a woman who has been evaluating people her entire adult life, and is very good at it. "This is Miss Ivy Crestwood," Edmund said. "She assists Dr. Perrin." "Does she?" said the Dowager, in a tone that contained an entire conversation's worth of observation, compressed into 2 words. "She has been instrumental in my recovery," Edmund said. "I am certain she has," said the Dowager, with perfect composure, and extended her hand to Ivy. "Miss Crestwood, I am very pleased to meet you." Ivy took her hand. "Your Grace, I hope the journey was comfortable." "It was long, and the roads were dreadful, and I do not care in the slightest." She kept hold of Ivy's hand for a moment longer than a greeting required, and looked at her very directly. "Thank you," she said. Quietly. Just those 2 words, the same 2 words her son had said weeks ago in a dim study. But from a mother's mouth they carried a different weight entirely, the weight of 3 years of letters and silence and praying in the dark that something would change. Ivy nodded once, because there was nothing adequate to say. And that was all right. The second guest arrived the same afternoon and was not invited. Lord Desmond Cale had been at breakfast when the Dowager's carriage arrived, and he had watched from the window, with his tea cooling in his hand and his face, doing very careful, very controlled things. He appeared in the drawing room an hour later, looking entirely unruffled. He stopped when he saw Edmund standing by the fireplace. Not sitting, standing. with a cup of tea in his hand and his full height and the easy authority of a man entirely at home in his own house. The moment lasted only a second, but Ivy, seated across the room beside the dowager, saw it. She saw the calculation behind Cale's eyes, quick and ruthless and immediately redirected. She saw him reorient, not retreating. Men like Cale never retreated directly, but pivoting, the way water finds a new route when the first one is blocked. "Edmund," Cale said warmly, moving forward, "this is remarkable. I had no idea you were so improved." "I did not announce it," Edmund said pleasantly. "You should have. This is wonderful news. The family will be delighted." "I am glad to hear it." Edmund set down his tea. "Desmond, I would like you to meet my mother, whom I believe you know, and Miss Ivy Crestwood, who will be joining the family shortly." The room held its breath. Ivy felt the dowager's hand, resting beside her on the settee, pressed very briefly and very deliberately against her own. Cale's smile remained exactly in place. This was, she thought, genuinely impressive in a purely technical sense. The man had extraordinary muscular control over his own face. "Joining the family," Cale repeated. "As my wife," Edmund said, the same tone he had used with Mrs. Dunford, clear and easy and entirely without theatre, because he had nothing to prove to anyone in this room. Cale turned to look at Ivy. She looked back at him with the same steady composure she had used in the corridor 3 weeks ago, the composure of a woman who has counted things in the dark and knows how to hold herself still when the ground moves. "I see," Cale said. "How very surprising." "Is it?" Edmund said. "I think it makes perfect sense." He moved across the room, not quickly, still measured in his steps, but fully upright and deliberate, and came to stand beside Ivy's chair. He did not sit. He stood beside her, and the meaning of it was so clear it needed no translation. Miss Crestwood has demonstrated better judgment and more genuine loyalty to this estate in 47 days than most people manage in a lifetime. Cale was quiet for a moment. The smile had thinned. "The solicitors will have questions," he said. "The solicitors work for me," Edmund said. "They will have answers." Another silence. Then Cale inclined his head. "Congratulations," he said, in the tone of someone placing a bet they know they have lost. "I wish you both very well." He left the room with his tea untouched and his back very straight, and he departed Thornvale the following morning without announcement, which was only fair, since he had arrived the same way. Edmund watched his carriage disappear down the long drive from the entrance hall window, and then turned to find Ivy standing behind him. "Is it done?" she asked. "His leverage is gone. His claim weakens considerably now that I am recovered and intend to marry." He paused. "He will find other angles. Men like Desmond always do, but not here. Not with you." Ivy looked at the empty drive, then back at Edmund. "You said joining the family shortly," she said. "I did. I told you to ask me again in a week. It has been a week. It has been 6 days. Close enough." She looked at him. He looked at her. Behind them, in the drawing room, they could hear the dowager speaking to Mrs. Dunford with the focused efficiency of a woman who had already decided that the East Wing needed new curtains and a proper airing and possibly a complete redecoration, which was her way of saying she was staying. "Edmund," Ivy said. "Yes." "Can you dance yet?" He considered this seriously. "I can walk without assistance. I can manage stairs. I cannot yet waltz. That was my condition. I know." He took her hand, the same way he had taken it a week ago, deliberately and with care. "I am prepared to negotiate on the dancing. I will waltz with you at our wedding. I give you my word, even if it kills me, which it may." Ivy felt the smile arrive before she could stop it. She did not try to stop it. She was tired of stopping things that deserved to happen. "Your word as a duke?" she said. "My word as a man," he said, "which I have been reliably informed is worth considerably more." She looked at him for a long, full, unhurried moment. She thought about 47 days, and broken floorboards, and candles burning in dark rooms, and a man who had hoped privately, and a woman who had counted things to stay steady, and how both of those habits were, at their heart, the same habit dressed in different clothes. She thought about Bet, who was safe, who was already writing letters, asking when she could come and see the famous manor she had been hearing about. She thought about the numbers she had counted in, the dark, which had gotten her through some very cold and very difficult years, and which she was not going to stop counting, but which she was no longer going to count alone. She thought about a man pressing his hands against the arms of a chair and rising, shaking and determined and alive, and looking up at her with the brightest eyes she had ever seen, and saying 3 words that were not a question. "All right," she said. "All right, yes?" he said, with the particular careful hope of a man who is not taking anything for granted. "All right, yes," she said. "But you are waltzing at our wedding, if it is the last thing either of us does." Edmund Harlow looked at her and smiled. The real smile, the full one, the one the older servants had spoken of in whispers, the one that filled rooms, and she felt it fill this one, felt it fill her, warm and irrevocable, and entirely hers. He lifted her hand and pressed his lips against her knuckles, slow and deliberate. And when he raised his head, his eyes were dark and steady, and holding her with the same quality they had held her from the very first day, like a man who has found something true and intends to keep it. "You came through a broken door," he said, quietly, "and everything that was broken in this house started becoming whole." Ivy looked at him. Outside, Thornvale's grounds were catching the last gold of the afternoon, the wet grass bright, the stone walls warm, the long drive empty now where Cale's carriage had been, the landscape open and clear and belonging entirely to the two of them and the life they were going to build in it. "I fell," she said. "You landed," he said. "There is a difference." She laughed. It came out soft and genuine and surprised, the way real laughter does, and Edmund kept hold of her hand and looked at her laughing like a man who has just discovered that 3 years of silence was worth it for the sound of this specific laugh in this specific room. Behind them, the dowager appeared in the drawing-room doorway, assessed the scene with one swift glance, and said to no one in particular, "Someone open the rest of the curtains. This house has been dark quite long enough." The footman moved. Light came in. All of it. All at once. 6 months later, Thornvale Manor hosted a wedding. It was not a small affair, because the Dowager Margaret Harlow did not believe in small affairs, and Mrs. Dunford had 3 years of suppressed domestic energy to release into floral arrangements, and the kitchen had been preparing for approximately 4 weeks with the intensity of a military campaign. Bet Crestwood, who was 17 and entirely unintimidated by duchesses or grand staircases or anything else Thornvale had to offer, stood beside her sister in the small dressing room and pinned the last of Ivy's hair into place with the focus of someone who had been practicing this specific task for months. "Are you frightened?" Bet asked. "No," Ivy said. Then, "A little?" "Good," said Bet. "It would be strange if you weren't." Ivy looked at herself in the glass. The woman looking back at her was, she thought, recognizably herself. Not transformed, not costumed, just herself, carefully dressed, with her dark hair up and a very small, very private expression on her face that she could not entirely control. "He is going to cry," Bet said wisely. "He absolutely is not." "He is." Edmund did not cry, but when Ivy came down the staircase of Thornvale's entrance hall, and he turned to look at her from where he stood at the bottom, standing without assistance on the legs that had come back to him, standing in his own house, on his own feet, to receive the woman who had walked through a broken door and refused to walk back out again. His face did something that was the precise equivalent of crying without any of the actual tears, and several of the senior staff had to look away to collect themselves. He took her hand at the bottom of the staircase. He looked at her face. "Hello," he said, which was not particularly eloquent for a man who had spent 3 years alone with his books, but it was sincere, and she had always valued sincerity above eloquence. "Hello," she said back. They were married in the Thornvale chapel, with the dowager in the front row, and Bet attempting to maintain dignity in the second, and George the footman doing absolutely nothing of the sort in the third. Dr. Perrin, who had been invited as a guest and was now regretting not bringing a second handkerchief, sat in the fourth row and thought about nerve response and false signals, and a young woman who had asked, simply and directly, "Is it real?" and a man who had said yes for the first time in years. At the wedding breakfast, Edmund danced with his wife. Not perfectly. His right leg was still finding its full strength, and he moved with a care that would have been imperceptible to anyone who had not watched him learn to walk again. But Ivy knew, and he knew she knew, and in the middle of the waltz, she looked up at him, and he looked down at her. And they were, for that moment, the only two people in the room. "You waltzed," she said. "I told you I would. You look like it might actually kill you." "It might," he said. "I find I do not care." She laughed. He pulled her slightly closer, not scandalously, just perceptibly, just enough, and she let him, and they turned together in the light of the room, where the curtains were all open and all the candles were lit, and the long, dark quiet of 3 years was over. Across the room, Bet was eating an enormous amount of cake and telling George, the footman, everything she knew about numbers being steady, which turned out to be quite a lot, having been told it regularly by her sister for years. The dowager watched her son dance with his new duchess and allowed herself, in the private space behind her careful expression, to feel the full weight of her gratitude, not just for the recovery, not just for the wedding, but for a broken floorboard and a girl with a medicine tray who had not known when to be afraid and had not been manageable from a distance and had brought light into a room that had forgotten it was dark. She raised her glass to no one in particular. Outside, Thornvale stood against the evening sky, warm and lit from within, its many windows glowing the color of candlelight, its long drive open and welcoming, its stone walls no longer bracing against anything but simply standing, the way things stand when they are no longer afraid. Inside, a duke and his duchess turned slowly in the center of a bright room, and the house breathed around them, and everything that had been broken wasn't broken anymore, not perfectly healed, not untouched by what had come before, but whole in the way that real things are whole, held together not by the absence of cracks, but by what had been poured into them, patience, honesty, the stubborn insistence of two people who had each learned to manage alone and had chosen, against all practical wisdom, to stop. Ivy Crestwood, who was now Ivy Harlow, who still counted things when she was nervous and always would, counted 3 things as they danced. 1. The number of broken floorboards that had changed her life. 2. The number of words in the sentence that had started everything. You are mine. 3. The number of times in the last 6 months that she had been completely and entirely certain of something without needing to count it at all. Once when he had laughed for the first time. Once when he had taken his first full step. And once, right now, in this room, in this light, in this life, with his hand in hers and the music playing and the whole of Thornvale warm and open around them. Some things did not need counting. Some things were simply and completely and permanently true.